Thank you for coming today. This is, my name is Michael Sarro. Many of you know who I am. I'm the Assistant Director at Magner Center. I work with students in the School of Vision Media and Performing Arts. So you come to me if you're a journalism major, TV, radio, film, and I'll help you with your career development. And I've been really interested in these Zoom sessions because, again, while we've all been in quarantine, in terms of your career, I wanted people to be productive. And I know quite a few people, and we've had a movie producer here. We've had a New York One reporter here last week. And I'm very happy to say that we have a TV and comic book writer here today as well, which I'm really excited to kind of introduce you to, and then we get to learn a little bit about him. And I know quite a few of you, because I recognize some of the names that are here, many of you are interested in TV and film. And again, it's like, if you're interested in television writing, why not hear it from somebody who's doing it? I think this is really great. Really quick, I want to introduce some of our co-hosts. So we have Cliff Frontera, who is a master's degree student at Brooklyn College, and he works at the Magner Center, and he meets with students interested in psychology. And like me, we're fans of Supergirl and that kind of content, the CW shows, so happy to have him here, and he has that knowledge. And then we have Camilla Brango, who is a recent grad, journalism and media studies major, and future superstar, honestly, and she's going to help interview Jay as well. We have a series of questions, and then once we're done with these questions, we'll ask all of you to put your questions into the chat, and then we will read them off to Jay, and we'll get some answers to those as well. So, Jay, thank you so much for being here. This is fantastic.
Yeah. Glad to be here. I'm very excited to talk to you guys.
It's really great, and we know each other from comic books and from New York Comic Con, and we have a mutual friend in John Broglia, who's an artist.
Yeah,
he's a really fantastic artist. He helped me create my own series a couple years ago, and I thought this was a really great amalgam of reaching out to my network and see who would be interested in speaking with students. So
totally.
let's get started. Jay, give us a little bit about your background. Where are you from, and why did you first decide to get into the entertainment industry? What really inspired you?
Well, I grew up in Northeast Pennsylvania, so not too far from your neck of the woods, just outside Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area. And I lived in Brooklyn for a while when I was breaking into comics. Basically, I've just always loved stories. I grew up reading comics and watching TV and, writing and drawing my own comic book stories when I was a kid and into high school. And for a long time, I thought I wanted to be a comic book artist. And so I went to a junior college as an art major for a semester. And at the end of the semester, the instructor told me, if you want to be an artist, if you want to be a comic book artist, you're going to have to learn how to be an artist. You have to learn how to draw. And that was his way of saying, like, I really have to apply myself, which I hadn't been at that point. And it kind of gave me some soul searching. And I realized that what I loved about comics wasn't necessarily drawing, it was telling stories. And that little talk helped me kind of pivot into focusing more on writing, which is what I switched to doing. And it was kind of off to the races. I never wanted to just write in one medium or one kind of story. I loved comic books. I loved TV. I loved movies. So I wanted to do all of that stuff. I love novels as well. And after college, I majored in creative writing in college. I went to Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania. And out of college, got involved in the comic book world a little bit more, made some friends on the internet, which was kind of just, becoming a thing at that point. This was late 90s, mid to late 90s. And made a friend who was starting to get published at DC named Devin Grayson. And she helped kind of open some doors for me a little bit in terms of introducing me to various editors and that sort of thing. And from there, I just submitted story after story after story. And finally, a couple of editors took a chance on me. And that was my entry into comic book writing. And after doing that for many years, I finally took the leap and really applied myself to get into television, which was my other big love. Comics and TV have always kind of gone hand in hand with me. And so about almost 10 years ago now, I made the jump into TV writing, and have been doing that along with comics for the past 8 or 9 years.
Wow, it's really great. I mean, which kind of comics? I know that you have some self. Is it Dynamo 5? But then you also worked on other titles like Green Lantern and Superman.
Yeah, my very first gig at it's kind of weird. I got hired at Marvel and DC right around the same time. So I think DC gave me my first gig. I wrote a 10-page Wonder Girl story for a book for an anthology called Secret Origins, I believe. And at the same time, or right around the same time, Marvel hired me to write the last issue of a book called What If. That had been canceled already, and they just needed to kind of run out the clock. And so even though DC hired me first, my Marvel book came out first. So my first published work was in a Marvel comic. And yeah, I did superhero books for a while at Marvel and DC, and then really wanted to branch out and do my own thing, which is what led me to producing and creating my own books at Image Comics.
Right, which was Dynamo 5.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, great. Camilla, you want to take the next?
Yes, of course. So once again, Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
We wanted to get into more of the experiences and what is like in the WB Writers Workshop. What advice do you have for the students that are interested in applying to the program as well?
Yeah, so the Warner Brothers Workshop, that was my gateway into television. A few of the TV studios in town have these sort of they're like apprenticeships or kind of boot camps for TV writing. Warner Brothers has the Warner Brothers TV Workshop. Universal, NBC, has a program called Writers on the Verge. Right. ABC Disney has one called the Disney Writing Fellowship, I believe. CBS has a writing program. And they're all aimed at discovering new voices for TV. They all have open submissions every year. In fact, they're just closing up their submissions now. They usually run for the month of May. You submit a sample script and you submit a personal essay. And if you're accepted, they're very competitive. But if you get in, for one thing, you have to be in LA. And from what I understand, I don't think any of them pay any kind of relocation service or anything. So you have to be able to be out here. And they're unpaid positions, most of them. I think the Disney Fellowship, you are paid a small salary, I believe. The other programs are unpaid, and it's like a once a week. I'll talk about the Warner Brothers one to keep it more simple, because that's the one I know most about. The Warner Brothers program meets once a week for a few hours and once a week after work. And you have a mentor who's a Warner Brothers executive, and every week they have a guest lecturer, a showrunner, a director, somebody from business affairs, an agent, a manager, and they kind of give a kind of seminar on that aspect of the TV business. And along with that, you're also writing a new episode. You're writing a spec episode of an existing show that you will, you'll go through as much as you can to kind of mimic the writing process on a TV show. So you have to write an outline, and you'll get notes on your outline, and you have to write a script, and you get notes on your script. And these notes come from the mentor in the program. And then at the end of the program, it runs about 3 or 4 months. And at the end, the head of the program will submit your work to all the Warner Brothers shows in the hopes that they will hire you. And to make that appealing, the Warner Brothers program will pay your salary in this show for the first 13 episodes usually, to make it more attractive to the show to hire you. And then, of course, if you've proven yourself, the theory is that the show will then pony up the money to keep you on staff. And that's what happened to me. I got through the program and got a job on a CW show called Ringer. And then when my option was up, which is the first 13 episodes, they made the decision that they were happy and wanted to keep me. And so they found the money in the budget to keep paying my salary, which is kind of how the program's supposed to work. So in terms of advice on the program, would be, you have to write, your writing sample is an existing is it an episode of an existing show? So my advice would be to, pick a show that you're passionate about and watch a ton of those shows and study them, study how many commercial breaks there are, study generally how many scenes there are in an act, just deconstruct the existing episodes and then try to make your episode kind of fit that format and that pattern. And also write from the heart, write something that only you can write, bring your own life experience to it. Before I was able to make my living as a writer, I had tons of stupid day jobs. And in one of them, I worked in an alarm center for Bank of America, which meant that I monitored bank alarms and ATM alarms. And anytime there was a bank alarm, I would have to look into it and ascertain whether it looked real or whether it was a false alarm. Sometimes I'd have to call the police. Sometimes I'd have to just call the bank and say, hey, did you guys, trip the alarm by accident? And so I use all that experience and put it into an episode of the old USA show called Burn Notice, which is the sample that I wrote that got me into the Warner Brothers program. So I was drawing on my own life experiences and applying that to a TV script. So that's my biggest piece of advice is draw on your own experiences when you're working on a sample.
That's excellent. Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, because again, one of the things that me being a writer, and then of course many of the students that are here who are writers, it's getting over that writer's block or maybe overthinking a script. And if you could draw from your own experiences, it makes it easier. What I've been doing lately is trying to pull some resources together for students to watch stuff on YouTube or online. There's a series on YouTube called Film Courage, and they talk writing, and they basically said, you have to want to love to write this script. Like, you can't wait to get back to it. Yeah. Do you feel that same way, Jay?
Yeah. There's a writer's expression that a lot of writers don't like writing, they like having written. And I think everybody can agree with that. But you do have to love the process. It shouldn't be a chore. There are parts of it that it's like any job. But the goal is to love the writing, and to love the process and to enjoy getting to sit down and roll up your sleeves at the keyboard and really dive into a scene or a script. And if you've lost sight of that, it's going to be unfortunate. So try to keep that. Put it this way, if you're bored writing it, people are going to be bored reading it. Like you've that excitement runs off the page and is a tangible thing that people can feel. Yeah.
Yeah, and this goes back to also some discussions I've had with students, and whether this is the same for television versus feature film writing, it's about, how quickly can you capture that reader's attention? Mm-hmm. So obviously with with network, you have your teaser section, which sort of sets the build for the rest of the episode, whoever the big bad is or whatever the major challenge. You agree then, like for students that are writing some spec scripts, TV spec and whatnot, that first 5 pages, that teaser really's got to click.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, start and grab your reader. Start as late in the action as you can. Find the most exciting way into it. The first 5 pages, that first teaser is really what's going to make or break and convince people to stick with the script and keep reading it. And also you want a strong conclusion. It's really the first 5 or 10 pages of the script and the last 5 or 10 pages, I think, are the most valuable to show the way into the story and also show that you can stick the landing. The whole thing's important, obviously, but it's definitely important to really kind of hook not just the person reading the script, your boss or the executive or an agent, but also the viewer, ultimately. Should this script get made down the road, somebody's flipping channels and they stumble across the teaser of your episode, you want it to be strong to hook them to keep watching the whole thing.
Right. Another thing maybe we could touch upon just a little bit, the difference between, And like you said, as a writer, you like to write different things and different areas, right? So we're talking about comics, TV,
Yep.
I'm sure probably film, and you had mentioned novel. There's different formats for all of them. I learned that the hard way with the comic book writing because I came up understanding it from a film perspective, and then when I wrote it in that way, you know, John, my artist, was like, "This is written for a person to act it," whereas
Right.
you know the comic books are different. It's singular you know panels and still has to show a flow on the page. What helped you in terms of learn sort of like the difference between those? Did you kind of learn on your own? Was it classwork, or were there outside resources like books?
I think, well, for one thing, I think it is much easier to go from comics to TV than TV or film to comics.
Right.
Because the comic book language, when you're writing a script, you know, well, here's, for one thing, there's no one right way to write a comic book script. No two comic book scripts look alike. They're as different as the writers behind them. There's no set like industry standard format. So that makes comics a little more challenging because like you have free reign to just tell the story however you want. But because of the nature of comics, you're isolating moments on a page. Each panel is a moment in time. So in a panel, you can't show a character doing two things. You can't show a character walk across the room and open a door. You could show him do one of those things. You can show a character walking across the room, and you can show a character opening a door, but to do two at the same time, you can't. Whereas in film or TV, you can write, this character walks across the room and opens the door, and the camera can follow them and open the door. So it's that's sort of an easier language to grasp, I think. But there's strengths and weaknesses to both formats, and it is, in film and TV, there's a set format. There's a screenplay format that has little variations depending on, you know, the show or the project, but it's pretty standard, which is not the case in comics. And the format stuff is stuff you can learn. There's screenplay books, or even just read screenplays. Read a lot of screenplays. Comic book scripts are great to read as well because you can see how different they all are and find a version that kind of works for you. But there's lots of examples out there.
Great. Yeah. So, you know, again, for students that don't know, I mean, you should go online. You should definitely try to get your hands on some scripts for like TV shows, films, comics, just to kind of get that understanding. Camilla, let's grab the next question.
Definitely. I think this is a great segue to get into what is like working into a writer's room. What is a typical day like? Do you have certain challenges that you can share with us?
Yeah, writers' rooms are fun, and it's like everything. I mean, there's no two are identical, but generally speaking, I mean, most writers' room hours are like 10 to 6, 10 to 5, 10 to 7, somewhere in there. And it's generally, you know, people sit around a big conference table. Sometimes there's couches. There's a lot of whiteboards surrounding the room. You have your writing staff. There's a writer's assistant whose job it is to take notes throughout the whole thing. They're kind of a stenographer, and they record and take notes of everything people are talking about. And then somebody will stand at the whiteboard and kind of write. They don't write everything people say. They just write kind of the bullet points of, you know, whatever thing we're trying to solve, whatever story point we're developing. And someone will sort of lead the room. It's either the showrunner or their number two, or sometimes writers' rooms work where whoever's writing that episode will kind of lead the room. And you just, you know, a typical episode we start with what's called Blue Sky, where we just talk very vaguely about like what are some things that could happen in this episode, what do we want to see. And then once we blue sky for a day or two, then we zero in on, okay, this is kind of what we want to do. And then it's a matter of, you know, sometimes we'll start with the theme. What's thematically, what are we saying this episode? What's the theme of the episode? So that all of our character stories and all the plot points can all kind of resonate around this single theme. And once we establish a theme, we can talk about our characters and what their own emotional journeys are going to be relating to that theme. And then we can get into actual plot and, you know, what are our characters going to be facing and who's the bad guy and what does the bad guy want, and how do we stop the bad guy from getting it, and just literally nuts and bolts storytelling. And it, we work for a few hours and then, take an hour for lunch. And some shows, the writer's room all eat together around the conference table. Other shows, people split up and go back to their offices and go for a walk or whatever. And then you resume in the afternoon. And, somebody usually brings coffee in the middle of the day. And, it's not too rigid. There's a lot of goofing around and talking and sharing stories, and all of that stuff is important, because the best storytelling and the best writing comes from when you can be comfortable and honest with your other writers, and you can reveal things about your own life and say, hey, this thing happened to me this one time, and here's how it made me feel. And if we can tap into that emotion in this storyline, maybe we do something similar. So you want kind of a safe space among your peers so that you can share things and get emotionally honest. That's how a writer's room will work best. And then generally, once you have an episode broken, once, it takes a week or so to kind of hammer out the details of an episode, then whoever's writing that episode sort of tags out of the room and goes off for a week or so and writes the script, while the rest of the writer's room repeats that process for the next episode. And when the writer of that previous episode is done, they turn it into the showrunner and they do a round of notes and have to do revisions. And on some shows, that writer will then go to set and shepherd that episode through production. Other shows don't send writers to set, and that writer will then just rotate right back into the writer's room and help break the next episode until they're at bat for their own. So it's always kind of a circle. People are cycling in and out of the room constantly.
How many scripts have you written so far in your time solo after the writing was process?
In how many episodes of TV have I written? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I have to think. At least a dozen. It'd take me a few minutes to count up exactly how many episodes I've written.
Sure. I want to go on to the next question, which is, did your background in comics help you secure the role that you have at Supergirl now? Was that a major thing? Was it a combination of the Warner Brothers workshop and then the 3 previous shows as well?
It was kind of all of the above. I joined Supergirl in season 5, and after season 4, they had a bit of a turnover. Some writers had moved on to other projects, and they needed some comic book people. Some of the folks who had left were big comic book nerds, and there weren't that many huge comic book people on the staff at that point. So they were definitely looking for somebody who was a comics nerd. So that definitely helped me get a meeting. But also, whenever you get a meeting to work on a TV show, the first thing that the boss does is read your work. And if they respond to your work, then you'll get a meeting on the show. So my writing actually definitely helped me get the meeting. The fact that I had a background in comic books and was a big nerd was a huge factor as well. So it was kind of, they were looking at a couple of different things.
Great.
I wanted to go into the next question and maybe play into what has been your favorite episode that you've ever written or either produced, or maybe both of them.
Let's see. It's probably the favorite episode I've written. I worked on a show called Zoo for 3 years. It was a CBS show that ran in the summer, and it was a big kind of summer thriller about animals revolting against mankind. It's on Netflix now. It's pretty fun. And there was an episode of that I wrote that was just a ton of fun. This show in particular, we would constantly challenge ourselves to just go bananas and have the most crazy things happening. This particular episode, I forget the title, but it was in season 3, and it involved a giant invisible snake that was terrorizing people. And when I heard the idea that we were going to have a giant invisible snake terrorizing people, because I had been out of the room for a little while, and when I came back in, they had already come up with part of the idea. And I had the idea that, what would be really cool is if the giant snake ate one of our characters, and then she cut her way out of it. So you have this cool shot where you're not seeing anything, and you see a knife come up out of thin air and slice open this invisible snake, and a girl pulls herself out. And I was only half serious, but the room went nuts and everybody loved it. And then we pitched it to our boss and he laughed and we're like, no, we really want to do this. And throughout the whole process, it was so absurd, but we were so insistent that like, we want to see a girl cut herself out of an invisible snake. And we did it. And it was just so much fun. So just that made that my favorite episode because it was just so bananas.
That's so funny. You know, creativity and collaborating and coming up with these ideas, and then of course seeing them on screen. You know, even as outlandish as some of it could be, but again, especially with the comic books and Supergirl, there's a lot that you can kind of like work with. You know.
Yeah, and especially with today's technology, you can do a lot. There's a lot of effects and a lot of visual stuff you can do that you couldn't do 10 years ago.
Right. Characters that are on the show, like John Jones, Martian Manhunter, McGann, you know, like how that really kind of plays. And it works really well with her as she's flying around with him and whatnot. That leads me to a question about, do any of the cast members pitch ideas to you guys at all? Again, they've been playing these characters for many years, so.
Yeah, for sure. And it depends on the show, and it depends on the boss how receptive we are to those ideas. But actors will always have ideas about their characters, and some get really into it. There's an actor on Supergirl named Jesse Rath who plays Brainiac 5, who is a huge comics nerd and really like he does a deep dive into Brainiac 5's comic book history and comes up with ideas on what we can do with his character and things he'd like to try. And a lot of the actors do as well, but Jesse in particular is more thorough. And on other shows as well, actors would have ideas for their characters. And sometimes we take those ideas and incorporate them, and other times it just doesn't quite fit, you know, where we're going with our storylines. Another factor is some shows, actors get to be producers on the show. Like when I worked on Ringer with Sarah Michelle Gellar, she was a producer on Ringer, which gave her a lot more creative input. You know, we couldn't just, ignore an idea if she had it. So there was, I think that's the only show I've worked on where the actor was also a producer. So it gave her a different kind of influence than regular actors would have. But even people who aren't producers still definitely have ideas about their characters.
Since we are talking about producers, can you mention a little bit more about the responsibilities of being a producer?
Yeah, the producer credit is kind of weird. When you see producers credited in TV, for instance, it's a little bit different in film. But in TV, when you see all those producer credits at the top of it, some of those producers are writers, and some of them are non-writing producers. On a lot of shows, there will be a director who works full-time on that show. He's called a producing director. So one of those producers is that director. Sometimes the producers are, like Greg Berlanti is a producer on Supergirl. He's our executive producer. But he's not super involved day-to-day on the show. Our showrunners are producers. For me, I'm a producer on Supergirl. I'm a supervising producer this year, and that just means that I'm more of an experienced writer. So my producer duties aren't that different from regular writer duties. It just means that I have a little more influence and I can rewrite writers who are less experienced than me. I can attend prep meetings and weigh in on wardrobe and stunts and more choices than simply writing. And producer, I'll be on set and help chime in with notes as we film. But to be fair, even writers who aren't producers sometimes cover their episodes and do that as well. So the writer-producer credit, for me, there's really not much difference between being a writer who's not a producer and being a writer who is a producer. It's really just a rank in the writing titles.
Did you join Supergirl with that title, or was that something after the season?
When I joined Supergirl, I was a producer, which is a set title. And then when I graduated to the next season, I was elevated to supervising producer. And then the season after next, we're in season 6 right now. Season 7, I'll be a co-executive producer. So in your contract, it's listed kind of what your title will be each season. You get what's called a bump. You get a raise each season generally.
Very nice. Do you ever go to set? What's it like, sort of like working on set? Do you have any advice for students who actually do, get internships where they are on set? What are some of the thoughts on that?
Yes, I've been lucky in that I think every show I've worked on, they've sent writers to set, which is great. I think it's important for writers to be on set. There are some showrunners who don't believe writers need to be there, and they don't send writers to set, which means the director and the actors will just call if they have questions. But having a writer on set, you're really there to answer questions and to help solve problems. So there'll be hours can go by where you're not really needed at all, and you just kind of sit and watch them shoot. But you're there to watch, and if a director isn't quite getting what we need from that scene, if the tone isn't quite right or a reaction isn't quite there from an actor, you'll have to step in and give that note to the director and say, oh, hey, this character needs to be more scared in this moment or whatever. And you're also there to answer questions. The director will have questions. The actors may have questions. You're there to approve props, and or sometimes the scene is written one way, and you get to the train station that you've decided to shoot at, and you realize that you can't quite shoot it the way you'd envisioned because the train station isn't laid out that way. Having the writer there is easier to kind of course correct and come up with an adjustment on the fly than if the writer wasn't there and the director would either have to figure it out himself or call back to LA and talk it out on the phone. So your responsibilities are really, again, answer questions, help solve problems. Being a writer on set in TV, it's a little weird because in television, the writer is the one with the most power. It's kind of a writer-driven medium, whereas the directors kind of go from show to show. They're just kind of a guest each week. Whereas in a movie, the director has the ultimate power. The director can make decisions and make changes. Whereas on a TV show, it's up to the showrunner. And a writer on set is sort of a conduit to the showrunner. So when you're on set, it's still the director's set. So you still have to be respectful to the director and to that process. So, if an actor isn't nailing a performance, you give that note to the director and let the director talk to the actor. You don't go straight to the actor. Sometimes the director may say to you, you tell him. I don't want to tell him. But you're still supposed to, it's the director's arena is set. So the writer is still supposed to kind of funnel everything through the director and be collaborative that way. And it's just about being respectful and one of the big things you'll watch rehearsals of scenes and you'll watch them shoot a scene. I try not to give a note the very first take or the very first rehearsal. Like, just sit back, let them find it a little bit. If they keep making the same, mistake each take, then you can chime in and pull the director aside. But sometimes give them a little time to work things out on their own, I think, is my approach.
It's a very interesting dynamic, and it's good. And it's a really great insight into what goes on in a daily basis. In terms of the shows that Supergirl, typically, I know this season it got cut short because of the pandemic and everything. Typically, it'd have about 21, 22 episodes in a season?
Supergirl generally does 22. This past season 5, we were only doing 20, which got cut down to 19 when the pandemic hit. But generally, Supergirl has done 22 or 23 episodes.
How long does it take for an episode sort of to be shot? I guess it would be different because in terms of you've written it, sure, but then now you're on set and they're acting it out. How long does that process take? And of course, there's the post-production process.
The actual shooting, the shooting's the easiest one to answer. That takes 10 days. You shoot for 8 days. and then the next episode starts shooting. But you have 2 days, which we call tandem days, where we have 2 units running at the same time. So we're shooting the last 2 days of the first episode, and we're shooting the first 2 days of the new episode at the same time with 2 different units running. So basically, every episode gets 10 days to shoot.
Okay. And I just want to do one more follow-up. So for those that don't know, they had a major crossover series this past fall in December into January, which was a 5-parter. It was really ambitious for the CW and those shows. Some of those shows, again, like Arrow, had been around for about, I think it was 8 years. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences in terms of how that went? And because it's a very iconic series, and for those that don't know, on Crisis on Infinite Earths, that was the name of the comic book series, and then the name of the show, the miniseries. I don't know if I want to spoil anything for anybody in terms of what happened in the original series. Let's just say some serious stuff had happened in Crisis on Infinite Earths. So this was a very ambitious kind of adaptation. What were your thoughts on all that?
It was that was a career highlight for me. I'm a huge comic book fan, obviously. I read the original Crisis when I was in high school. I still have my original comics, all dog-eared and beat up. And so when I joined Supergirl, I told my bosses that, hey, I know you're doing the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover this year. I don't know how you decide who gets to do what episodes, but I'm volunteering. Like, if you want to volunteer, I would love to do it. And they took me up on it. Awesome. And I couldn't be happier. So it was so much fun. It was a ton of work because you literally had 5 different shows. They all shot in Vancouver, but they all had separate stages and separate crews and separate directors. And all 5 shows worked together to tell one massive story. And we had our cast members appeared on all 5 shows. So it was this massive endeavor with these big whiteboards with these color-coded charts about which actor needed to be on which set at what time. And, we had to factor in days off for people so that nobody got too fatigued and overworked and didn't have to be in 2 places at once. And sometimes we did have to have 2 places at once. So we'd have, Melissa Benoist as Supergirl on one show, and we'd have her stunt double playing Supergirl on another show doing stunt work. And we'd use her digitally in another sequence when it's a flight sequence where we're using digital technology. So it was incredibly ambitious, incredibly complicated, and a ton of fun and super rewarding.
Yeah. And I think one of the other highlights from that too was that, and for those that haven't seen it or not sure, definitely do some research into Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was and that was an amazing series for me too as a kid. I got to it in maybe the early 90s where it had come out in the mid 80s, and I sort of went to a comic book shop and I found it, and I'm like, what the hell is this? And then it's definitely a landmark thing in comics. And if you are interested in learning a little bit about where some of the source material comes from, that's definitely something to look into, especially since TV and film loves to go back to that type of source material. But no spoilers, it was definitely something that changed the industry, especially for DC Comics as well. So for those of you that are not, and like I said, I don't want to spoil anything, and then you have to watch the miniseries. I know there was this one, there's a couple of, all right, I don't want to say it. Okay, so Cami, let's jump to the next question before I spoil something.
Perfect. Watch it, please. So we wanted to get into a little bit more of your predictions. What do you think are some of the changes that are going to happen now after the pandemic? And maybe what are some of the things that students can start to do that would like to become writers or producers, and maybe they should start right now?
In terms of predictions, I don't know. I do think that TV sets are going to be different. I'm not quite sure how. I don't know how you reconcile social distancing with how many people need to be on TV set at all time. But there's going to have to be safety measures implemented that's going to make it more challenging. And there's talk of limiting how many crew members can be on a stage at a certain time. There's talk of quarantining an entire crew at one time in a set location and just shooting everything at once and keeping everybody on the same campus. That's what Tyler Perry is doing with his studio for his shows down in Atlanta. They're still figuring out how it's going to work. We shoot up in Vancouver in Canada. How it's going to work when we go back to set. We don't have a plan yet. They're still kind of looking at all the options and the risks and what kind of preventative measures we can take. But I do think it's going to be different. There's going to be more, I think we'll see a little more digital effects used for crowd scenes rather than get real extras, have digital extras you can use, that sort of thing. Sadly, I think writers may get sent to set less often now, even though I think it is important for them to be there. The risk may outweigh the reward, because we could, just talk FaceTime with a director if we have to. In terms of what students can do now to position themselves the best, I really think it's all about the writing. Just spend this time to just hone your craft. I would worry less about, physical production experience and being on set, because that's stuff that you'll get taught when you're working. But the writing is really, the most important part of the job. So I would read as many screenplays as you can, and just write as much as you can, just because the more you write, the better you're going to get. It's such a simple piece of advice, but it's the most true, that the more you do it, the better you'll get. And to, really challenge yourself and ask for feedback from people you trust and take their notes, and then just keep writing. It sounds so simple, but it really is the best thing you could do for yourself.
When it comes to writing spec scripts, any advice in terms of spec scripts? I know that you had talked about it a little bit earlier. I've seen different kind of advice in terms of like, don't choose a show that might have been on for like 10 years or 8 years. Maybe choose something that's not in its first year and hasn't had this kind of longevity, but somewhere in that middle ground. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, the whole spec script thing is it's kind of a polarizing debate in the industry right now, because there's one school of thought that says spec scripts are a good idea because your job as a TV writer is generally going to be to deliver the vision of your showrunner, to write in their voice. And a spec script teaches you how to do that because you're writing in the voice of whatever show you're doing a spec of. There's another school of thought that says to write a pilot, to write something original, so you can really show your own voice and your own ideas. And pilots are something you could potentially sell one day. For programs like the Warner Brothers program I spoke about, you need a spec script. That's what they want to see to gauge whether, that's their submission process, is a spec script. And they have a list of all the shows that you can choose from to spec. I do think choosing a show that's been on a long time is not a great idea. Like, I think Supernatural is still a show that Warner Brothers will let you spec as a sample, but the show's been on for so long that I think it would be hard-pressed to find something new to say that not just hasn't been on the show, but that other people haven't spec'd already as well. And your point earlier about a show that's too new to spec, there is that danger, but I don't think there's anything wrong with speccing something that's only been on the air for a year. If you have a cool take on it, I say go for it. When I was in the Warner Brothers program, I wrote a Justified spec, and Justified had only been on that 1 year. So I wrote a spec that took place after season 1. And I don't think there's anything wrong with speccing a relatively new show. I wouldn't spec a show that just started. I would let it have at least one full season under its belt before I would spec it. But I think any show that's been on for 1 year, between 1 and 5 or 6, I would say is fair game, in my opinion, but your mileage may vary.
Okay. No, it's interesting to know. Definitely interesting to know. It's a good point, about shows like Criminal Minds or Supernatural, which has been on for so many years.
Yeah.
So something to keep in mind if any of you are interested in writing some spec scripts. And as Jay had said, definitely binge watching a lot of them and really getting to know the characters. And, you know, and when I think of it, it's like, okay, so, you know, if any of these characters have a specific catchphrase that they do, a specific mannerism, certain things that they do that makes it, that's the nuances you should look for to make sure that you're actually speaking in their voice rather than saying, Supergirl did this and then she did this, you know, but she has these kind of mannerisms or her relationships with other people. And she'll act differently between other people. I mean, who would act? I mean, anybody would act differently with Lex Luthor. So, but
Yes.
you know, but that's the kind of thing that I think many students should really think about.
Yeah, and when you're watching a show that you want to spec, I would, when I spec'd my Burn Notice episode, I sat down and literally had a notebook with me and watched an episode of Burn Notice and outlined it as I watched. Every scene, I would just write a sentence, like, what is this scene about? This scene is Michael meets a guy who needs help. And then the next scene, one little short description of what that scene is, and just outline the whole episode. And it'll just help you see how the episode came together, what kind of the nuts and bolts are in that episode. And it'll make it a little easier to conceive your own, I think, once you kind of look under the hood that way. It's a good way to just sort of see the rhythms that you may not get just by watching it.
Right. And I just want to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the chat. When writing these scripts, especially like a spec script, again, students should probably be aware not to make like the episode, I would assume, like too grandiose, or you know, you killed somebody in the episode as a cast member. It's like, right. Don't do anything crazy in that way.
Yeah, you want to play within, you know, put the toys back the way you found them. You know, don't break the show. Don't kill off a major character or reveal the secret origin of something, you know, blah, blah, blah. Just write a good episode of that show. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. You know, don't write the Supergirl episode where Martian Manhunter dies. You know, right. That's you know, play color within the lines, I guess.
Would that include, because again, with these comic book shows, it's you can go into their rogues gallery. So do you think it's a good idea to tap into a villain or a challenge that hasn't been tapped into yet? Or do you like go back and kind of repeat, like pull them back from like the storyline, like a Lex, and you pull them back from like an earlier episode?
No, I think it's certainly fair to pull in a new villain, because that's one of the advantages of writing a spec, is that it's not going to get made. So you do have a chance to do things that they can't do in that show. The trick is find something that isn't something that they wouldn't do. So find a new villain that Supergirl has never fought before from the comics if you want, as long as it's something interesting. Or because the other CW shows, all the superhero shows are on the same universe now, you know, you could have a villain from Arrow in your Flash spec, or, you know, that sort of thing. Play with that interconnectivity if you want. And I had another point I was going to make, but I can't remember what it is. Oh, if you did want to go back to Lex Luthor, for instance, make sure you're saying something new about Lex Luthor, showing us a side of him that we haven't done already. Justify why you're choosing to use that character again, if you're going to use him.
All right, great. All right, so let's, if you have any questions, you know, you can put them in the chat, and, you know, we'll go through. We'll try to go through as many as we can. You know, if we don't go through all of them, we can always take those questions and share them with Jay, and then, you know, we can kind of address those. But Cliff, if you want to start going through.
Yes. So the first question that we had, what advice do you have for those that want to write for TV film? What should their maybe homework be?
I think that's I would say, again, you know, write as much as you can, read screenplays, and, you know, dissect and watch the kind of shows you want to write. And afterwards, you know, Michael, I'll put together a list of resources online you can find where you can find screenplays to read, and TV scripts to read, and comic book scripts to read. And I'll assemble that stuff that you can share with your students, you know, in another couple of days.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's really great.
Sure.
Very good. I mean, there are certain things, Film Freeway, and there's a couple other resources, but anything that you could provide where they can get their hands on scripts would be
Sure.
fantastic. Thank you.
Yep.
So the next question I have is, what's the writing process for writing a TV show, and how do you suggest to get into the industry for larger types of comics like Marvel and DC?
To get into the industry, meaning like the Marvel and DC TV shows, or to get into the comic book industry?
From here, it looks
right?
like both.
Okay. Let's see here. The writing process is kind of as I outlined before. You know, we most shows break every episode collaboratively. You know, you work as a room to break the main points of the episode, and then once you have the rough shape, kind of what happens in every scene, the writer assigned to that episode goes off and has a week or so to write it, where you have your blueprint, you have your kind of bullet points for what's going to happen in every scene, and then it's up to that writer to go in and flesh those out and give them life, and you know, structure the scene and the dialogue and all of that. And then once you have your draft, you send it to the boss, to the showrunner. And some showrunners will give you notes and you'll do a second draft. Some showrunners will just take the script and they'll make any corrections and adjustments they need to on their own before it goes then to the studio, and the studio will give notes and you'll make any adjustments they need. And then it goes to the network and they give their notes and you make any adjustments the network needs. And then it goes to production, to the director and to the crew. And you may need to make changes for them as well. If you've written your massive fight sequence and they say, yeah, we can't have Supergirl throw a city bus, she could throw a dumpster, and you know, you make little adjustments for production, or you know, oh, this scene's supposed to be in a bowling alley, but we can't find a good bowling alley that'll suit our purposes. Could it be at a arcade instead? That sort of thing, you know, you need to make those adjustments as well for production, and then it gets made. And as for how to kind of break into Marvel and DC, I think in the comic book industry, it's changed so much since I broke in. I think it's almost unheard of for somebody to break in at Marvel and DC these days with no other credits, just out of the blue. So I think the biggest way to break in is to get published at smaller companies, or get published online, or get published in a different medium. You know, write a play. None of which is easy, of course. I make it sound like it's no big deal. But with comics, I think to get published at Marvel and DC, you have to show that you can write a comic. So I would try to find some small press anthology, or find an artist on your own and team up to create your own comic. With the internet, you can publish these things digitally without having to pay for a printer or anything like that, or printing costs, or have it professionally distributed. You can just make your own online comic. And then it's just a matter of, you know, Twitter's a great resource. You can, you know, just find friends on Twitter, follow artists, follow editors, follow publishers. You'll find smaller publishers that are willing to take submissions from newer writers. It's just all about kind of getting enmeshed in that landscape.
Yeah, and to go back to that just really quick too, again, I self-published some of my own comic books, which is, again, how Jay and I sort of met, because I was working at Comic-Con, and I did that through Kickstarter. And yeah, you know, Kickstarter is really great if it's done right and done correctly, and really thought through. And but you can totally self-publish your own works that way.
Yeah.
And it could be anything that you'd want. I mean, sure, you have a GoFundMe. What's the other one? Patreon? Patreon, I think, is another.
Yes.
Like, if you're a highly creative person and you can crank out content, that might be a way to kind of do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
We are scrolling through the chat to find some of the questions, and Ray asked, she actually majored in creative writing with a concentration in playwriting, and she wanted to know about do you see this as an asset in the writer's room, or maybe what other characteristics do you want your writers to have when they become part of your team?
In terms of being a playwright, is that a background in
like a double major, or being part of the creative writing as well as playwriting?
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. The more experience and training you can bring, the better. One of my colleagues on Supergirl is also a playwright. And I know a lot of playwrights who've transitioned from writing plays to writing television and movies. So there's definitely a commonality there. And, writing plays is what we do essentially as well, just in a much more intimate setting. So yeah, anything that trains you how to write creatively and tell a story and depict human emotions is good, is a plus.
Very true. Cliff, you want to take another one?
Sure. So what's your advice for keeping a realistic feel to fantasy situations in writing?
I think it would be just to make sure to have your characters react appropriately. If a dragon comes over the horizon and it's supposed to be incredible, have your characters react that way. If this is a world where dragons fly over the horizon every single day, the way airplanes take off from an airport, don't have them react that way. It's all about how your characters react, I think, will sort of guide the audience into how they're supposed to react in this fantasy world. And different characters obviously will react different ways, but whoever your main character is, whoever your main point of view character is, just let them be sort of the audience's guide as to how they're supposed to be reacting to what fantasy elements we're seeing.
In terms of, the show Supergirl, it is very dedicated to inclusivity and diversity, and there's so many different characters, so many different voices on the show. I mean, that's something that has really been very popular with students and just the audience members alone who want to be represented. So that decision sort of is like a mantra, basically, for you guys in the writer's room and just as a series as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a concerted effort to be inclusive and to just preach kindness and acceptance. And even a lot of our villains, a lot of times we try to redeem rather than just vanquish and put in jail and show a better way. I think it's a good message. I like that we can have an action show that does have a lot of visual fun, but underlying the message is about hope and help, not violence and punishment.
Right. And Gene Roddenberry, I think, had said, now, for those that don't know who Gene Roddenberry is, he is a creator of Star Trek, and he had said that sometimes the best type of storytelling, or especially science fiction, again, especially with Star Trek in the day, was a reflection on current issues. Yeah. And it seems like that's something that you guys have done, very well in terms of the show.
Yeah. Allegory. I mean, Buffy has done that incredibly well as well back in the day in terms of just using metaphor and allegory to tell stories about the human experience, but dressing it up with monsters and supervillains and that sort of thing. And I think that's especially true in any kind of fantasy show, is to ground it in kind of relatable human emotion.
Okay. Let's see, what else we have? And I want to make sure that we go over some questions that haven't been repeated. We kind of touched upon.
There was a question that somewhat relates to what we were just talking about in terms of Supergirl. So earlier you had spoken about how it's important to bring your own life experiences to writing a script. So how do you go about writing characters from different orientations and backgrounds that may not reflect your own experiences to not only ensure that viewers feel represented, but their stories are also told authentically?
I think that's a good question. I mean, that's where you have the benefit of a diverse writing group, a writing staff. You have people of different ethnicities and different sexual orientations and different economic backgrounds, and the more varied you can have that writing staff, the more varied and fully realized your show will be. When you're writing a script on your own, when you're writing that spec and trying to do it all yourself, it's just, I think, important to just practice empathy. Even if you're writing about a character who has a different skin color than you or grew up in different circumstances, to just really do your best, like do some research into what that character may have experienced and just practice empathy. Just try to put yourself in that character's shoes to let that inform how that character would, go about whatever the plot is dictating.
I have a question here. How do you decide when recurring characters become main characters on a show?
Sometimes it just feels right. Sometimes it's a matter of, this character, has really taken off and the fans are really responding to this character, so we want to use them more. Other times it's a matter of if you have a series regular, you own that actor, which means you have first dibs on that actor for the whole season, that their first obligation is to you. If you have a recurring character who's not under contract, there may come a time where, we want to use that character in episode 16. But he's not available because he booked a gig on another show. So if you foresee wanting to use that character more often, then it becomes a situation where you might want to entertain making that character a series regular so that actor is in first position for your show, which means that you have first dibs on that actor. And even a series regular doesn't automatically mean that series regular will be in every single episode of the show. A lot of actors have a deal where they're in 9 out of 13 episodes of a season, for instance. They're considered a series regular, but their contract doesn't state they have to be in every episode. They're guaranteed 9 out of 13. And if you want to use them more, you have to pay them for those additional episodes. So it's a number of contractual things, but it really boils down to, do you want to be able to have that actor whenever you want them? That's what kind of triggers making them a regular.
There's another question here that I think is very important as somebody that's starting to write. What advice would you give to someone who is struggling to maybe make scenes and storylines connect?
Boy, that's a good question. I think I would just I would approach it from emotion first. Approach the story you're telling for emotion. Like, emotionally, what are you trying to say? Thematically, what are you trying to say? What point are you trying to get across on an emotional level? And then just keep the plot as simple as possible. Plot twists are fun, but plot twists don't mean anything if you're not engaged with the characters and whatever emotional journey they're on, or what emotional struggles they're feeling. I wouldn't rush it. I mean, once you become a professional writer, you're going to face deadlines that you have to hit. But if you can afford to, if the story isn't quite working for you, or you're struggling with something, put it aside for a day or two. Let your mind work on it subconsciously. Think about something else. And a lot of times that little block will get loosened once you turn your mind to something else and stop trying to force it to happen.
Right.
Another question that I think is really great. What is your opinion on mentorship, and how does a student maybe approach someone in the desired field to kind of create that type of connection?
I think mentorship is very important and something that is useful and there should be more of. In terms of how to approach somebody, I would, I guess, pick a mentor figure that you see some kinship with, somebody who is telling the kinds of stories you want to tell, or who comes from a similar background as you, or some sort of overlap there, to help increase your chances of this mentor wanting to spend time on you. And in terms of how to approach them, I would just be polite, be respectful. Don't pester the person. If they can't take on a mentee at that time, thank them for their time, and look somewhere else. And I think also be clear on what you're asking. Have a specific ask in mind rather than just a blanket, will you be my mentor? Mm-hmm. Start with something concrete. Can I ask you a few questions about your career path? Will you read this thing I wrote and give me notes, as opposed to just sort of a generic catch-all of, will you mentor me? and then hopefully, that will establish a dialogue that will develop into a mentorship.
As a follow-up to that, I was thinking, how important is LinkedIn then in that process? And would you suggest the Writers Guild, at least the networking aspect, a portion of the Writers Guild, as resources for students to use?
LinkedIn, I honestly don't think, in the TV writing world, LinkedIn isn't really relevant. I know some people connect that way, but I've barely used it ever. I think Twitter is far more valuable because you'll be able to, there's tons of TV writers on Twitter who talk craft all the time and will share writing tips and answer questions. And so I think Twitter is a much better use of your time than LinkedIn. And in terms of, what was the second part of your question? I lost it.
Whether the Writers Guild,
yes,
the WGA.
The WGA is really, I don't know how many, and this is my own ignorance, I don't know what their resources are for people who aren't in the guild, because it is a professional guild, so it's really geared towards people who are already working writers. So at this point, at people who aren't professional writers yet, I don't honestly know how much help the guild would be, or if they have resources that you'd have access to. Because I think a lot of their resources you need to have like a membership to get access to.
Right. I think there is, yes.
But I could be wrong.
I think it's some type of membership. I think they have some type of access to networking or even events or just other types of resources. It might be something to look into for sure for some students. Okay. Actually, I want to ask my own question really quick.
Sure.
During the pandemic and quarantine, were you guys still working on the next season?
Yes. Yeah. We, the writer's room closed down, stopped meeting physically, and we started doing like Zoom. We had a Zoom writer's room for, I forget how long it went, a few months. We're on hiatus now, but we worked remotely, I think, for about 3 months. Yeah. From like mid-March till end of May, I guess. So yeah, and it's different, but it works. We've been able to churn out the first few scripts of season 6.
Excellent. Okay, great.
There is another question here that I think is important to learn from and start to prepare. Any tips on pitching ideas, or maybe how does a junior writer go about when they first pitch an idea?
Yeah, I guess that my question would be pitching it where, but since we can't answer that, the pitching ideas, I mean, if you're pitching it like to a studio or something, that's something that you would first need to get you need connections to even get that meeting. But let's just talk about pitching in the abstract. Pitching is all about just describing your project, convincing someone to buy your project or read your project or watch your project. So pitching should be in my opinion, as conversational as you can make it. Imagine you're just telling a friend about a movie you just saw. You're not going to tell them every single plot point. You're just going to tell them, oh, it was cool, this thing happened, and you had this guy, and he wanted to get this, and then this happened. So it's not going point by point. It's just telling your story in a conversational manner. The other aspect of pitching would be to not just pitch your story, but pitch why you are the one to tell the story. Focus on why this story is important to you, why you want to tell this story, what compels you to tell this story, how you came up with the idea, like why you want to tell it. Those are all important parts. When I pitch, I kind of start off with that. Here's the thing I'm going to pitch you, and here's why I want to pitch you this story. And then I go into the nuts and bolts of the pitch itself. And later, when I hook Michael up with some resources, there's a couple great podcasts that talk a lot about pitching and the career path of a TV writer that I think would be useful to you guys.
Great, thank you.
Another question that comes up that I think is really helpful. What would you say are the most important skills and abilities to succeed in this industry?
A few. It's definitely important to be a good writer. You know, that's should go without saying. But also be collaborative, be respectful and easy to get along with. Because a lot of being a TV writer is literally just being in a writer's room all day with people. And so you want to be somebody who's not argumentative and who's not going to get defensive. You want to be somebody who is a helper, who, you know, if somebody pitches an idea that doesn't quite work, but it almost works, pitch a version that helps make it work. You know, help build up pitches, not tear down other people's pitches. Again, it's about being collaborative. And just look for ways, especially, you know, your first TV job, you're going to be a junior writer. And just a TV writer's job ultimately is to make the showrunner's job easier. So just look for ways to do that. Literally. Will it help? Can I, you know, I think it helps if I had good handwriting. I have good handwriting. So when I was a junior writer, I would always volunteer to write on the whiteboard because a lot of people hate doing that. And it gave me something to do. It gave me a way to contribute. So just look for ways to contribute. Another thing I would do is to do research, you know, after the room wraps. If you're talking about, you know, nuclear warheads, I would look into nuclear warheads and come in the next day with some bullet points about, oh, here's some things I learned about nuclear warheads. It might help, you know, bolster the story we're telling. So it's just finding ways you can be helpful will benefit you greatly.
Let's see.
I wanted to check in as well that we're good in timing, Jay, and that you are okay with maybe 15 more minutes.
Yeah, 15 more minutes, great.
Perfect. I think some of the questions that other students are asking is maybe, and a little bit more about yourself is, would you ever want to transition into something else? What has been maybe your favorite character? Do you work with, maybe what would you decide is the best medium to write an original story versus comic or TV script? Some of the things that we can learn a little bit more about you.
Sure. Let's see here. I definitely want to transition. You know, I would love to write a movie. I would love to write a novel. These are both things I want to do. And it's just a matter of, I used to say finding time to do it, but it's really about making the time to do it, making it a priority. But I still love TV and comics. So I have a hard time turning my back on any of them. With myself personally, you know, favorite characters to write. I like writing a lot of the Supergirl characters. Brainiac 5 is always fun to write because he's just got a funny voice, and you can just throw weird things at him. And Jesse, the actor, is so good that he can, you know, just kind of riff on whatever you give him. David Harewood as Martian Manhunter is great just because he's got that presence and that authority that's so much fun. You know, I love writing for Supergirl and her sister Alex just because that sisterhood dynamic that they have is so great. I had the honor of writing an episode this past season that dealt a lot about trans issues. We have an actress named Nicole Maines who is trans, and her character is trans, and we told a story that dealt heavily about her issues that face the trans community and herself. And that was a lot of, I don't want to say fun. It was rewarding and important. And I felt honored to be able to write that story. And Nicole was very involved in the crafting of it. And so that was kind of a highlight for me as well. And in terms of my favorite medium to tell stories in, boy, it really depends on the story I'm telling, I have to say. It sounds like a cop-out, but there are some stories that are better told through comics and some stories that are better told through television and some stories that I think are better, make for better novels. And so it's really about which medium best suits the idea I'm trying to get across, I think.
Great. So there's another question that comes up in terms of like working remotely. Do you think the current circumstances and how we've moved more towards technology may impact writers' rooms in terms of maybe not everyone has to be in LA or they can be across the US and still communicate and facilitate the writers' rooms?
Yeah, I can see that happening. I think it will. Here's the thing. I think studios will be open to it happening because a virtual writer's room is a lot cheaper than a real writer's room. There's a lot less overhead and office space you have to rent. But I think a lot of showrunners are going to push to keep the physical writer's rooms as much as they can, because I do think that there is that tangibility of being in the same room with somebody on a day-to-day basis that helps foster the sort of emotional honesty I was talking about earlier, of really opening up with people so that you can be as honest as possible when telling these stories. However, I do think that this will, I know that I've seen some showrunners online at least talk about how this does open up the playing field a little bit, so that not all writers have to be based in LA. And this might be a chance for writers who can't physically move out here for one reason or another to still perhaps have a voice in the writer's room. But I do think it's going to be a tough transition, and there will be some pushback in some areas, but this has proven that we can craft stories remotely. And so I hope that it will provide an avenue for people who can't or don't want to be in LA full time to still participate in some ways.
If the pandemic hadn't happened, and we have students that have this interest in writing, would you suggest that they consider moving out to LA? Is LA really the major place where writing for television especially takes place?
Yeah, I wish the answer was different, because I know that it's far easier to say move to LA than it is to physically move to LA. It's expensive here and crowded, and the job competition is fierce. But the fact remains that if you want to work in television, you kind of have to be in LA right now.
Right.
So there was another question from Caitlin about having an agent or a manager in order to get into one of these programs. Maybe it's as difficult as a student, you might not be able to get it. What else can we do, or what advice do you have on that?
Yeah, to get into these writing programs, you don't need a manager or an agent. That's the good thing. And in fact, being in these programs will help you get a manager or an agent. When I was in it, kind of at the tail end of the program, they would submit your work to a handful of agents and managers that they were friendly with, and that's how I got my first agent, was through the Warner Brothers program. So you definitely don't need one to get into the program, and being in the program will help you get one. Because getting an agent or a manager is not easy. I think managers are a little more realistic than getting an agent, because managers tend to be more open to taking a chance on an unproven writer, whereas agents have so much stuff on their plate that they have a harder time making time to discover new voices, whereas managers are a little more open to that.
And I have one last question that I think I wanted to end it in a fun note. I think as a viewer, we all cry or feel bad when a character dies or they leave. Wondering what is the decision that you made to take out a character, or how do you feel in the writer's room when we have to shut one of them off?
I think it depends on the character, and it depends on the actor, sadly. There are some actors that, for whatever reason, didn't quite work on a show, and then it makes sense to write that character out. There are other times where, for a creative reason, for a storytelling reason, that character just has kind of outlived his or her usefulness on the show, even though we love the actor, and then it just makes sense to be, we just can't justify having that character around anymore. It doesn't make narrative sense. So that's hard. I'm trying to think, in my personal experience, I haven't, mainly because most of the shows I've worked on have been pretty short-lived. So we haven't had that much time to get attached to people. But I haven't had a real emotional send-off. The closest I could come was I wrote the episode of Supergirl where we wrote off James Olsen. We kind of sent him off into the sunset. and that was fun. I had a lot of fun writing that storyline, and I felt honored to be able to kind of craft his exit, with the other writers, of course. But it was also my first season on the show, so I didn't have a huge connection to James the character or Makad the actor. So I was emotionally sort of distant from it, but just from loving the Jimmy Olsen character as a fan, I felt honored to be able to kind of help, contribute to his send-off. So it's sometimes it's sad, sometimes it's happy. It just kind of depends on the circumstances.
I have two more questions, and I think we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
And again, we want to thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
There were two questions I had in mind. One, along the lines of the WB Writers Competition, and and it's funny too, because I meet with a lot of students who are writers and want to be writers, but the resume or the personal statement it's not as fun, obviously. And I look at resumes every day. Do you have any advice in terms of the resume or the personal statement, in terms of functionality, in terms of that? I mean, whenever I work with students, I try to make sure that whenever they have written up any kind of content, any kind of articles, any kind of scripts, they make it available through some type of Google Doc link, or there's links on the resume itself. Have you ever seen that, or do you have any thoughts on that whole process?
I mean, that's a little out of my wheelhouse. I haven't had much, like a resume isn't something writers traffic in that much these days. For these writing programs, you definitely need like a personal statement. They each have kind of different essay questions, and those are definitely almost as important as your writing sample, because that's what's going to give them an indication of who you are as a person. And so those are really important to you can't just say, well, I love telling stories and I want to tell stories because it's fun and I love TV. You need to really kind of dig deeper and talk about like why you love storytelling and what your own background is. What was your upbringing like? How were you raised? What part of the country or world are you from? All of these things are going to impact the lens through which you tell your stories. So these essays are a good way to give people an indication of who you are and kind of what your personal journey has been and why you want to tell stories. And I struggled with that too, because I had a happy childhood. I grew up in a very normal setting. I'm not driven by some childhood trauma or some great injustice I'm trying to wrong. I tell stories because I want to entertain people. It's as simple as that. And so you have to find a compelling way to communicate that. I wish I could find the essay that I wrote for Warner Brothers. I can't seem to track it down. Somebody asked me to see it a couple weeks ago. But I know I talked about, my dad was a cop and my mom was a teacher and my stepdad was a minister. And I grew up in these sort of, very normal confines, but I still wanted to tell stories to entertain as an escape from my humdrum life growing up in Pennsylvania. And I just looked for ways to tie into my backstory, just what compels me rather to want to tell stories. So essays are not fun to write, but for these programs, they're important.
That inner motivation as to why you chose this path, or why you would be really great, that insight into who you are. That's something that I work with students to try to develop more so than the characters that they write, which is interesting. And that just means digging into yourself.
Yep.
So there's that. And then the last thing, and it's a fun one, I feel like you guys have dropped the breadcrumbs a little bit towards the new Superman. There might be a new Superman show on the horizon. Do you see a lot of collaboration there to have Superman spin off from Supergirl?
Well, there is a Superman show. Sorry, there is a Superman show coming up. I don't know when it's launching. I think sometime whenever the next season is. We don't know when that's going to be because of the pandemic. But yeah, there is a Superman show called Superman and Lois. It is the Tyler Hoechlin, who appeared as Superman a few times on Supergirl and in Crisis, is Superman. So I don't know if it's technically a spin-off of Supergirl, but it is spinning out of the Superman we've established. And I'm sure there will be, we haven't really delved into it much yet because we're dealing with the pandemic that has messed up with our schedule. But I'm sure at some point there will be some sort of cross-pollination between the two shows. I just don't know when or what it will look like. We haven't discussed it at all yet.
All right.
But as a fan, I can't wait because I love our Superman.
Yeah, no, he's really great, and he has that personality and that fun kind of personality that I know some people said that they weren't sure about Henry Cavill. Henry Cavill's great, but in a different way. And then, of course, it was always great seeing Brandon Routh as Superman one more time, too, which...
That was a real treat.
Yeah. For those of you that don't know, watch Superman Returns, mid-2000s. I think it was a great movie. And he got a chance to, almost 15 years later, put the suit back on, which is...
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, that's it. Thank you so much, Jay. This was, so informative, so great. I want to thank all the students that attended. I really do hope that all of you really got some valuable insight into this. I mean, really pull back kind of like that curtain in terms of the inner workings of television and working in a writer's room and how you kind of get your start and overcome writer's block. It's so great. And I really do appreciate everybody's questions and your time. If people want to connect with you, do you suggest Twitter?
Twitter's the best place to reach me. It's just my name, @JFaerber.
Excellent.